All right, welcome to our second video lecture in environmental science. Today we're going to go a little more in depth into ecosystems. And really the key here is that it's all about how things interact, all about how things work together. So we're going to start with energy because energy sort of sets the basis for our ecosystem. The amount of energy that an ecosystem receives is going to be really the big determinant about how much biodiversity or how many different kinds of animals and plants can be found there. What we're looking at here is an energy pyramid. And because of the first and second law of thermodynamics, the first being that energy is conserved, so you can't create or destroy energy, you can only pass it on from one form to the next. And the second being that every time you have an energy transfer, some of it is going to be lost as heat, so you actually lose it as unusable energy. It's not gone, it's still energy, but it's heat. Think about in our bodies when we eat food, right? We go through digestion, and the process of digestion is actually akin to burning food very, very slowly. And we create heat as a byproduct. That's why our internal temperature is like 98.6 degrees, because as we digest food, as we do biochemical processes within our body, we create heat, we generate heat. And all organisms do that, plants, animals, whatever. That's why you cover plants in the winter. If you put like a plastic cover over them, it keeps them from freezing. That's because it traps the heat that they're losing as they do their biochemical jobs, as they do photosynthesis and their cells do cellular respiration and all of that. So in an ecosystem, the amount of energy you get, which you're of course going to get from the sun, is going to be a big determinant in how much biodiversity, how productive that ecosystem can be, because the sun is going to determine how many producers you can have, because your producers are your plants, which are taking the energy from the sun and doing photosynthesis and creating, taking inorganic chemicals, things like nitrogen in the soil and nitrates and nitrites, which are nitrogen and oxygen compounds, NO3 and NO2. Those are inorganic compounds, and actually converting them into things like proteins, which are organic compounds. That's the producer's job, taking inorganic chemicals, turning them into organic chemicals. And they do that using energy from the sun in most of the Earth's ecosystems. Now, some of them are, like at the bottom of the ocean, are free of the sun's energy, and they get that from chemical energy. So they're chemi producers. But anyway, so they're going to take that energy and they're going to turn it into their bodies. They're literally going to build plants out of energy and inorganic chemicals. They're going to build proteins and build carbohydrates. And they're going to build their biomass out of that. And that's, if you start with 100% of that producer energy, 90% of that energy is lost every time you move up a trophic level. So the consumers are only going to be able to get about 10% of the energy from the producers. They're going to eat and eat and eat and eat, and they're going to waste a lot of that energy as heat. That's where a lot of that energy goes. They're going to use some of that energy too for just their everyday lives. They're going to move around. They're going to do the work that they need to do in their bodies. Then the primary consumers are only going to get about 1% of that energy, because they're going to only get 10% of the 10%, and that's 1%. And then your third level consumers, your tertiary consumers, are only going to have about 0.1% of that total energy that you had fixed in primary productivity. That's what we call primary productivity, is how much energy the plants are able to fix in the ecosystem. Primary productivity, and I lost some of that in the black there, but primary productivity is the amount of energy. It's this 100% number. That's why we don't usually have this idea is the reason we don't usually have very many apex predators. So if you think about like the number of animals on like the grasslands, the savanna in Africa, you have tons and tons of wildebeest, tons and tons of zebras. Those are primary consumers. They eat the grass. So there's a lot of energy available to them, but you don't have that many lions. Lions are an apex predator. They're going to be eating these other consumers, and there's just less energy available to them. And then, of course, in the total food web, we have, like we were talking about last night, the decomposers, whose job it is to take these organic chemicals that the consumers and producers were made of and turn them back into inorganic chemicals that the primary producers can then use again. So they complete that whole circle of life cycle. So that's an ecosystem. So it's going to be determined, a lot of how much of all of this you can have is going to be determined by the sun, because that's going to determine your primary producers, and your primary producers are the base for your whole food pyramid. So then we get into thinking about species diversity. So the more energy you have, the more species diversity you can usually support, because the more energy you have at the bottom of that food chain. But that's not the only aspect that contributes to biodiversity. You also have the amount of moisture, right? The amount of water available, or in this case, the dryness, the amount of water not available, and the temperature. These are other abiotic factors. So energy, rainfall, or amount of moisture, and temperature are three major abiotic factors that are going to contribute to the amount of biodiversity a particular ecosystem can sustain. And this gives rise to what we call the differential amount of temperature, which is primarily from solar energy, from the sunlight. So it's basically a measure of energy. And water, or moisture, is going to give rise to what we call biomes. Now, biomes are these areas of similar ecosystems that we find around the world, and there tend to be similar ones. And they're listed here in this picture. You have tundra, which you typically find in the Arctic regions, but you can also find at the top of mountains, because elevation is also going to affect the distribution of both temperature and dryness. The higher up in the mountains you go, the colder it gets. So the less and less temperature you have, so the higher up this pyramid you're going to go. And also mountains affect how much moisture you have, because on one side of the mountains that's basically going to cause the clouds to dump all their rain, and the other side of the mountain is going to be very dry. So typically, as you go up a mountain, it's very similar as if you're moving away from the equator on the Earth. You get similar sorts of changes in biomes. So tundra can be found at the poles of the Earth. So say this is like the equator here. And so up at the North Pole, the land up towards that would be tundra, Arctic tundra, where it's very, very cold and there's not a lot of moisture. We tend to be on the increasing dryness part because all the water is frozen there, which isn't useful water. As you get to a little bit warmer and a little bit more moisture, then you get into what are called boreal forests. These are coniferous forests, pine forests. You see these in Russia and Canada significantly, Scandinavia as well. You'll see some boreal forests. These are pine-based forests, lots of conifers, and these are just below the Arctic regions. These trees are particularly well adapted to the cold and to snow because they're softwood, so they can shed the snow. Their branches bend. That's really easy. And then in places in temperate regions where you're starting to get much warmer, you can have a variety of different ecosystems depending on how much water you have, or a variety of different biomes. Where you have the most water is where trees grow. So that's where you get your temperate forests. Now, temperate forests are defined by changing in seasons. They're going to have deciduous trees. So that is trees that lose their leaves. So they're going to have a fall where the leaves turn color, and a winter where the leaves fall off, and then a spring and a summer where the leaves are growing back and you're nice and green. Now, in areas where you don't have quite as much rain, not enough rain to support the growth of trees, because trees need lots and lots of water, that's where you'll get grasslands. Think prairies, steppes, depending on where you are in the world. There are prairies in North America, there are steppes in Asia, there are pampas in South America. But these are grasslands. Where there's not enough water for trees to grow, but you still get a lot of sunlight and a lot of energy, so you get a really rich ecosystem with a lot of primary productivity, but it's in grass, not in trees. Then if you get really, really dry in these temperate areas, you get to what's called chaparral, which is like a scrub land where you have brushes and stuff. Think like Southern California. And then if you get even drier, you get into the desert where you don't even have a lot of scrubs growing, only specially adapted plants like cacti and things like that. And that's all in the temperate region, where you have temperatures that change pretty dramatically. They get fairly cold and pretty warm as well. That's most of the United States is going to be in your temperate region. We're at the very southern end of the temperate region, almost into tropical, what you call subtropical. And then once you get into the tropical region here, you're talking about warm temperatures all year round, and typically a lot of rain as well in this tropical area. So that's where you get tropical forests, where you get lots of rain and lots of heat. You get lots of temperature. You're getting lots and lots of tree growth. You get some of the most biodiverse areas. So these tropical rainforests are going to be the most species-rich areas with tons and tons of biodiversity, because there's so much energy available and there's so much water available that your primary productivity, your plant growth, is really, really high. If you get into areas where there's a little bit less rainfall, we're getting into increasing dryness. Here you can get tropical grasslands. This is like the savannas in Africa. You have some sparse trees and really rich grasslands that can support tons and tons of animals. Think the most massive herds of animals that we can think of roam these grasslands. And you can even get tropical deserts where it's really warm and there's a lot of temperature, a lot of solar energy, but not a lot of water. And that's the defining characteristic of a desert. You just don't have enough water to support a lot of primary productivity. And so this is going to vary on geography. The closer you are to the equator, the higher your temperature is. So the more likely you are to be in this bound. Geography also affects rainfall. You're going to get more rainfall right around the equator, typically at about 20 degrees north of the equator and 20 degrees south. You get a sort of lack of rain. So that's where we find most of the world's deserts, and that has to do with the circulation of air in the atmosphere, which we'll talk about later. Some of our most species-rich communities, like we talked about, are tropical rainforests, also coral reefs. Coral reefs are also going to be in that tropical area. They're like the rainforest of the ocean. The ocean bottom actually has a ton of energy to sustain ecosystems as well, not because of sunlight, but because of chemical support and detritus from up above and higher levels. And very large tropical lakes are going to have high levels of biodiversity as well, again, because they're going to have a lot of plant growth, a lot of primary productivity because they're in that tropical area, right? Lots of sunlight, lots of temperature, lots of moisture. That's going to lead to tons of primary productivity. Ecosystems also experience a concept called synergy. And what this is this is where the whole is more than the sum of its parts, which means that when you put all the pieces together, you get even more than you would have expected. You get what are called emergent properties, right? These properties that wouldn't be there if all the parts weren't working together. An example of that is over here. You see it says different neurons work together to function as a brain. The neurons by themselves could not make a brain. The brain is something more complicated than just a bunch of neurons. Because the neurons work together, you get thought processes and language and memories and these things that we wouldn't get with just the basic neuron functioning. Which is pretty amazing. We see the same thing in ecosystems, and it's all about these community interactions, that they work together to accomplish things that no single part could do on its own. And even when you add them together, there's some like almost mystical quality of cooperation that leads to ecosystem services, things that ecosystems do for us that we don't even think about, the services that they provide that we don't value until they're gone, usually. So, for example, many ecosystems work together to filter our water. This is particularly true for wetlands, and that's very true in the area that we are. Because the water slows down here and goes through swamps and has to filter through the soil to get down into the water table. It actually filters waste out of the water. And that is an important ecosystem service for us because we need clean water to survive. Also, decomposition, breaking down of detritus. So our detritivores and our decomposers, cycling those nutrients is a huge ecosystem service that is provided for us. We would have to pay so much money to engineer a way to get carbon to cycle through an ecosystem or to get through to cycle through anything. But ecosystems do that for us for free. We don't they just do that. It's amazing. Protection from the elements as well. That's something very near and dear to New Orleans because our wetlands around us provide us protection from storm surge, because a swamp can absorb so much water through a storm surge that it can actually prevent flooding due to a hurricane. The same is true for marshes. Marshes aren't quite as good as absorbing water as swamp is, but still it can hold a ton of water, preventing it from actually inundating like the city of New Orleans. That's why it's so important, even to New Orleans, that the outlying areas around the place, I think Plaquemines Parish or any of the other sort of low-lying areas where we're having major problems with land subsidence, is super important for our survival because they protect they protect us from storm surge. Equally, mountains are going to shape the way that weather flows around a continent, and so that's an important ecosystem service. Biodiversity is particularly important for this. So having lots and lots of species of animals, a large number of species of animals and plants, the more biodiversity we have, the more our ecosystem services are provided because we get medicines, food, materials for shelter. We get all these things from living organisms. Like something like 90% of the medicines that were created in the last 50 years came from living organisms. They were chemicals that were found in the rainforest or in ocean species. And so the more biodiversity we have, the more resources we have for these goals. Without that biodiversity, we lose those important ecosystem services. And so that's really important as well. We're going to wrap up this conversation here, but we're going to have another in-depth look at ecosystems and the interactions that species have within an ecosystem in our next video.